What is up, guys? Welcome back to RanWhenParked. I am very excited today because we are finally going to stop procrastinating and we are going to start working on the Landcruiser again. Honestly, we're kind of in the home stretch on this thing. If you think about it, I mean, the frame's redone, the body's redone. I've gotten some progress going, not on camera here that I'm going to show you guys in a second. And really, we're in like the final assembly, wiring, and driving this thing stage. So it's going to be an interesting day. It's going to be an interesting episode. Let's get moving. Okay, so the last time you guys saw this thing, I was doing all the body work. It was just kind of coming together. I think I finished painting it and doing all the lizard skin on the inside. Well, I've made a little progress since then. So I finished the fabrication on the trans tunnel. I boxed in the area around the twin stick shifters. I then painted it, seam sealed it, painted it, and did the lizard skin on it. I also redid the linkages for the twin sticks. I didn't show that on camera because it's exactly the same as it was before, except the throws are a lot shorter now, because before it wanted to tear the boot. So I didn't really have enough room for the type of throw that it actually has. But now it's nice and short. So that's all set. I also hooked up the shifter and installed all that stuff appropriately. Obviously, I also put the body on the frame. It's actually not bolted down, but all the bolts are in. So it's aligned, in all 6 points. That is all set. I also decided to redo the wiring for the motor. So I made a new wiring harness here. It's all flying lead harness. Everything's labeled and ready to go. And that is to replace this one. And the reason why is because when I built this thing, I used some wiring that I'd never used before, and it all corroded and just came apart. You can see that one's broken right there. This one's broken. So that was kind of weird. I'd never seen that before, but I decided the best thing that I could do is just start from scratch. So I just have to pull this apart a little bit and wire this one in fully. I also got an entire Speedway Motors, like 14 or 16 circuit wiring harness for this thing. That'll cover everything to run the entire thing. Blinkers, hazards, brakes, lights, all the stuff on the dash, the column, etc. That is all there. I also bought a Deutsch bulkhead connector to go through the Firewall. So this is like a 31 pin. That'll cover everything. These are the shrink wrap boots for that. I have enough loom to sink a small ship. I have awesome LED lights, all factory Toyota parts here, which is kind of cool. We'll look at that eventually. So I think the target for this episode is probably going to be to get back to where we were and make this thing run again. If you guys remember, it did run, but that was before I took it all apart and did all the body work and all, the fiberglass work and stuff. So I think I'm going to rewire the motor. I'm going to get temporary power to it, and we're going to make it run. But in order to do that, we need to put the fuel system back in. And if you all remember, the fuel system is a plastic tank that goes under the passenger seat. That's the factory location. And there's a whole exoskeleton that goes along this floor for seat mounts and everything, just to stiffen up the fiberglass and stuff that we made. It hits all the body mounts in here, and it's a whole exoskeleton. And that is all sitting right here. So we're going to clean this up because it's been sitting around for about 4 months now since I took all that stuff apart. And we are going to piece all that together, put the fuel tank in, get it all plumbed up, probably get the seats back in, get these guys back in, which are our doorpost supports that we made, all billet aluminum. Those go in the front, and that's kind of the hinge points for this, or the anchor points for this thing. And then once we've done all that, it should fire right up. Once it fires right up, then we'll start talking about next steps. But I think for this episode, we're going to get it running again. So let's get moving. All right, guys, so we got our fuel system back in. We got our fuel lines hooked up. That stuff is all done. We also got our entire exoskeleton back in here. And just a reminder, for those that don't remember, this is basically a full body stiffening assembly. So we milled these billet brackets here that tie into the body mount, so they go right down to the frame. They go up the A-pillar and they hit the lower hinge mount. And then they also capture this bar that goes straight across the bottom over to the rear body mount right here. This is a stainless steel plate that's bonded into the tub. And then it has the exoskeleton that goes all the way across over the gas tank. And then we have the exact same thing on the other side. So that really, really strengthens this area up. And the seats mount to both these things. So this way, the seats aren't just like bolted through the fiberglass with a fender washer. Like if you ever get into an accident with it, you're going to have a lot more strength in that seat structure. So that's why I built that whole thing. It's just a safety thing. So now that that's done, we could put the seats in, but we're not going to because it's just going to be cumbersome while we're doing the wiring. So next thing we need to do to get it running is to sort out the engine harness. So here is our new wiring harness for the engine. It's just a fuse box and 2 relays. That's all we need to run this thing. And then here is our new chassis harness. So what we need to do is count out exactly how many wires need to come through the firewall on the chassis harness, exactly how many need to come through on the engine harness, and make sure that we have enough pins in our bulkhead, and then identify those pins, because what we're going to do is we are going to pin this thing into the bulkhead, get both wiring harnesses mounted up under the dash under there, and then we will pin the engine harness into the other side of the bulkhead, and that way we can put some fuel in this thing, start it up, and make sure that we're back where we're at, or where we were before, that is to say. So I guess let's clip the zip ties on these things and start counting wires and make sure that, I think this is a 32 pin connector, I have enough pins, because to be honest with you, I didn't check that. Okay, so I have this all separated and it's actually pretty simple. All of this stuff stays inside the car, steering column, you know, switches, relays, etc., indicators, you know. This is essentially the rear of the car. This is essentially the front of the car. Between these two is 22 circuits. We have another about 9 right here for a grand total of exactly 31, which this is a 31 pin connector. However, a couple of these we won't be using, like ground, key on power, normal power. I will be piggybacking off a couple of these, and that's convenient because the big power wire here, I will pull 2 through the bulkhead connector for that to run this whole system. So I'll have those in series, make sure we have plenty of power going through the pins. So with that, we can start by figuring out where we're going to mount this thing in the firewall, drill a hole, grind it out to the right size, get it mounted, and then we'll start by getting the engine harness stuff pinned up through it. So let's get moving. All right, so we bored a fresh hole. That always feels good to do through our nicely just refinished body. And we got it all mounted, so it fits pretty good right there. It's not in the way. Here's how the connector works. It just threads on and off. It's like a quarter turn type thing. Let's see if I can get it back on there again. Maybe not. Come on. Whatever. We'll figure it out. So the next thing we're going to do is just pin a couple of these wires that need to go through the firewall in. But first, we're going to figure out where we're going to mount this thing. So I'm thinking it's going to go something like right there. But I also have to get the other fuse box up in there and make sure they're going to work well together. So let me just do that really quick, get these 2 things mounted, and then we'll pull it back out. We'll start clipping wires and we'll pin them into the connector. All right, guys, so there's our first wires all through. We got our fuel pump power, and we have our powers for all the ECU stuff right there. Grounds are going to stay inside. I'm just going to put 1 heavy gauge ground through, and then I'm just going to use like a ground bar inside the cab on the firewall for all the grounds. Power is going to be similar. I'm just going to run like maybe 2 heavy gauge, like 10 or 12s through there, and then that'll power everything inside. So yeah, all we really have to do now is cut all of this old stuff off, connect it up to the new stuff, run some power, hook up the jumper pack essentially, and combine some grounds, and then put a little fuel in the tank, and we'll fire it up and see if we're back to at least running. Once we have that, we will finish up the whole wiring harness. So kind of exciting. Let's keep going. So the next thing we have to do is get some of our inputs from the ECU, from the engine bay, into the cab through our bulkhead connector, which I've since removed because I'm just going to start working on it out here. So what I did was cut off my old wiring harness here. Obviously made note of, what was left here. So I have essentially 1, 2, 3 key-on powers right there, and then 1 constant power right there. We have our... You know what? I don't know what this blue one is, actually. Oh, you know what? Nope, never mind. That's the constant power. These 3 are the key-on powers. This is the turn-on for the fuel pump from the ECU. This is ground, which is not going to go into the cab. Here is our starter relay switch, which will go into the cab. And then I have a bunch of, I guess we'll say, optionals from when I redid this whole harness and turned it into a standalone. So those are VSS we're not using. What is this one? Fan 1 ground we are using, but that's going to stay in the engine bay. Speed sensor we're not using because we're going to go to a GPS speedometer. Check engine light control we will use. I will have a check engine light. Tow haul we're not using because that's really a transmission thing, and we have a TH350. TCC brake we are not using. TAC output we will be using. That's going into the interior. And fan 2 ground we will be using, but it will be staying in the engine bay. So we're going to go through those. The ones that are going to the interior are going to go to the interior. The ones that are staying in the engine bay will stay. We'll wire all that stuff in. We will get this thing to run once again. And then I'm going to loom up the whole harness once and for all and call it done. So let's wrap up this engine bay wiring, and then we can get on to the chassis wiring. All right, so we have all our power set up here, constant and switched, and we have our starter relay wired up, and we have our fuel pump turn on wired up. So the only things left are these three out of the accessory harness, and that is tack signal, check engine light control, and OBD2, which is the serial data that goes to the OBD port. That's pin 58 off of the blue connector, pin 10 off the red connector, and pin 46 off the red connector. So all three of these need to get sent into the cabin so I can control this thing. The rest of these I'm going to tape off into the harness. I might use them later, but not for right now. So I think I'm going to have to extend these to get them down the harness and into the right spot. So we're going to go ahead and do that, get them pinned in, and then we'll move forward. All right, so now that we have all those done, next thing we have to do is power and ground. So I don't want to run power and ground through the harness because it's just going to take up some pins that I don't need. So I bought these from Fastronics. These are bulkhead connectors for power and ground. But the problem is they're really heavy and kind of clunky because they are 3/8 lug for, like, you know, full battery power to the car. That's not what I need. I just need, you know, everything that's going to power the interior. So what I did was I took the positive one and I cut the lug off both sides, and I took the stud in the middle and drilled it and tapped it 5/16. So the lugs are smaller and way more low profile, and they just thread out this way. And then you can just put your terminals on the bolt and you can thread it back in. And that way I can get power and ground through the Firewall in a relatively low profile solution. So what I need to do is do the same thing to the ground side, and then we're going to figure out a way to mount it, and we're going to mount it in the Firewall. And then I just need to set up powers and ground so we can fire this thing up with a little gasoline. So let's modify this one. So there we go. They are both now converted to thread-in type. Looks good. Now I think what I want to do is mount them right here, and I have this stupid hole that I want to get rid of anyway. So I would just put one in that hole and drill another, but it's a little bit big. So I think what I'm going to do to put them both right next to each other right there is make a little bulkhead out of this aluminum plate. So I already went and traced them. So I'm just going to bore that out. So one sits right there, one sits right there, and then I just bolt the plate in with some self-tappers on the edges and then just seal it in. That way I get rid of the hole, and I get my bulkheads for my power and ground going into there. So we're just going to go ahead and cut that apart real quick, make that, and then put it in the Firewall. All right, so there she is. Came out pretty nice. The bulkheads fit in there perfectly. They're a little bit tight, which is good, but they kind of pop right in there. Very nice. And then the way this is going to install is right there. So I already notched out what was left of the fiberglass up under there a little bit. It's going to bolt in right there. I'll seal it in. I'll trim the fiberglass out from the back side and paint it black, and we'll have a nice bulkhead right there for power and ground to go through. And once again, since this is a fiberglass tub, the ground is very important because all the stuff inside I can't just ground to the body like you normally would. So I need a lot of ground, you know, terminals in there. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove the brake booster, drill my 3 holes in here, notch out the fiberglass, paint this thing black, and install it. And then we can move onward and upward with getting this thing running. So let's just knock that out real quick. All right, so that's that. Came out looking great. We got our brake booster back on. And not only did we solve our little problem here of getting power and ground through the firewall, but we also eliminated one more hole that I wasn't going to use anyway. And guys, I do have boots, just in case anyone was going to point that out. So I have the positive side boot, and I have a negative side boot. So they'll wind up looking something just like that once they're done. I think it's going to be pretty smooth, look good. So the next thing we're going to do is make a ground strap that's going to come off of this thing and probably in behind the brake booster and go right to the back of the head right there, because the engine's already grounded to the frame. So as long as I go to the head, which I think is just going to be the closest location, it's going to be nice and clean, then we'll be grounded out. Then we just have to take our harness here, ground it to the back side of this, take our engine harness, ground it to the back side of the head, and then power for the engine harness is right here. I think that's our constant 12 volt, and put it to the positive terminal up in there, and we'll be ready to put power to the outside of this thing and fire it up with a little bit of fuel. So let's wrap it up, get it running. All right, guys, so we have our ground strap on now. It goes to the back side of the head. I also went ahead and put a ring terminal on the ground coming out of the engine harness here. It also goes to the back side of the head. Now we need our powers. And I think instead of jumping this thing all around like I did last time I made it run, I'm going to actually finish this correctly. I'm going to run a wire from here to the charging stud on the alternator, and then from the charging stud on the alternator all the way around to the other side of the motor and to the starter. And then all I have to do when I do the battery mount and everything on the passenger side is run that positive terminal down to the starter. And for today, all I'll have to do is hook the jumper pack right up to the starter, and I'll power up the whole system that way. So quick tech tip while we're here. When you're working on car projects, take all the heavy gauge wiring you possibly can out of these things. This is a variety of different battery cables and amp power wires and things like that. And I'm going to be able to make my whole system out of just what I had sitting around in my random wiring box. And the reason why I say that is because this stuff is really, really expensive. Like, this length of wire is probably $35. So, yeah, definitely always take the heavy gauge wire you possibly can out of all these project cars. So let's go ahead and get this positive side all wired up. All right, guys, so we got our power wires here all done and loomed. You can see them down in there. Pretty clean solution over here. We got everything hooked up as you guys saw before back here. Obviously, I need some loom on these wires, and I need a couple boots on the positive and negative, but I think that's all good for now. I did put about, I don't know, half a gallon of fuel in the tank. And the only questions now are going to be, does it have oil, which I'll check in a second? And can I just put power right here and actually power the starter? I don't know. That wire that goes from the alt to the starter, the intent of that isn't to be able to power the starter. Normally you'd go much thicker from the battery to the starter, so we shall see. Because these are 4 gauge, which are 6 gauge, which is perfectly fine to power the interior and power the alt, but I might need to go direct to the starter. So, I'm going to check the oil real quick. Then we're going to see if this thing starts. Close. Make sure our coils are plugged in here. All our spark plug wires are on. All right. Alright guys, so runs pretty good. It is missing a little bit, which I thought was a coil pack, but as it turns out, this injector is stuck. Obviously I was doing a little diagnostics, that's why it's not plugged in. So I'm going to go ahead and pull all the injectors and throw them in the ultrasonic cleaner, and hopefully we'll get that knocked out. It did sit for, I don't know, a year and a half with the fuel in them, and modern fuel kind of sucks. So I guess I'm not surprised. I'll clean the injectors and see what we got. All right, we are back. Injectors are clean. We're going to give this thing one more go and see if she idles a little bit better. Much better. Now it sounds great. All right, guys. Well, we got this thing running again. I'm glad I got it back to where it was before. I'm glad there wasn't any permanent damage sitting around that long, and I'm certainly glad that once I redid all the wiring, it all ran right, because that's always a relief. You know, a lot of people don't like wiring, but I actually enjoy it because it's so satisfying when everything works. But that's all I got for you today. On the next episode, we're definitely going to continue putting the interior back together. We got to put a custom steering column in this. We need to wire everything up. We got to put the front end back on it. We have a lot of fabrication to do. So stick with me. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell. Definitely tell me what you're thinking down below. And I'll see you guys next time on RanWhenParked.